All right, my name is Norma Craham. I am the chair of the Cybersecurity, Privacy, and Digital Innovation Practice at Van Scoyk Associates, a recovering government employee like many people from the State Department, Commerce Department, FEMA, Department of Transportation, and I have been working on cybersecurity issues since 2005. I would say I was evangelizing in the wind in 2005. I would say cyber, and people would say privacy. And we would have to explain the differences. And so when we talk about, fast forward into an amazing panel and conversation we have today on supply chain security, and we think about the global implications of supply chain, one of the things I did early in my career was focus on international trade, right? Bilateral, multilateral trade negotiations, and the goal was to have a global supply chain, right? It added efficiency, it added choice, theoretically it brought down cost. And fast forward to today, when you think about even just the basic risks from cybersecurity, it's a huge challenge. But if you add lessons learned that we had from COVID, geopolitical risk, what you're starting to see is in the United States and around the world, what was this global expansion has become a bit of a retrenchment because we are worried about security issues. So we have a great panel. We're going to talk about all of these issues, and at least for me to set the stage, when I say supply chain security, we're talking about products, services, hardware, software, the panoply. Now the good news is we're going to solve these problems today. We're going to talk about different tools that are going to help us do this. We're going to talk about new global policy and regulatory requirements that are hopefully will help on disclosures. And for those of you, if you were the users or the sellers, right, we're focusing on how we embed security in at the front end. All right, so I'm going to ask each of our esteemed panels, starting with Grant, to just do quick introductions of themselves, their company. You can have a deep thought about supply chain, and then we'll do questions of the panel.
Deep thought, that's all right. So I'm Grant Bourzikas.
You can't do that, sorry.
They won't let me do, they've already understood me very well. Grant Bourzikas, I'm the Chief Security Officer at Cloudflare. I just crossed, 2024 was my 20th year as a CISO. So started back in 2004 working in casinos. Been at Cloudflare. Joe's left me in a great spot, so thank you, Joe. So it's nice to have your predecessor here, which is very good and good guy. But previously, most of my experience has been in banking. My other fun fact was I was the last CISO at the real Silicon Valley Bank. So I got good stories if you come to Barry's later on. So yes, that's a good story. Previously to that, I spent time as the global CISO for HSBC, and spent time in power, nuclear, grid, and then I also worked for McAfee. But I've done this 20 years, and I love AI, but I haven't asked any questions because I finished my master's and coded Python for 3 years every night for 3 hours. So I'm very opinionated, but I haven't said anything.
We'll get to that. All right, Meta.
Meta Parlikar, the Chief Technology Officer and one of the co-founders of Casper Labs. And we are the builders of the public decentralized Casper Layer 1 blockchain protocol. 5 years at Casper Labs. Before that, I was building Layer 1 blockchains of the open source community in the wild world of Web3, so to speak. And prior to that, I worked at Avalara, a senior director of engineering and responsible for their product, their core tax engine, their taxability research groups, compliance groups, and got my inroads into web analytics before it was a big thing, and 25 years in software as a service. I still call it software as a service, not cloud, because it's software as a service. Very happy to be here, and yeah, excited to talk about supply chain tooling.
Well, thank you. It's wonderful to be here. My name is Avni Desai. I am the CEO of Shellman. We are the largest cybersecurity assessment firm in the U.S. that provide everything from SOC, ISO, to FedRAMP, PCI, and pen testing. My background is I'm a computer engineer. I spent my first 4 years as an ethical hacker. Then I realized I wasn't showering for several days in the basement, and I was wearing cartoon shirts, and I was like, I got to get out of here. So I went from there to risk management, became the director of privacy for KPMG International, and then I have been at Shellman for about 11 years. So my passion is also emerging technology and how do we make sure that regulations and frameworks don't lag emerging technologies, because that's what we've seen in cloud. Really excited about how AI, we're seeing a little bit less of that. But really also excited to talk about supply chain and what we're seeing from a regulatory perspective. So yeah, thanks.
Excellent. You know, policy, regulatory compliance, those tend not to be sexy topics, but they are for supply chain security. You know, one of the things that we're spending a lot of time, I think, globally is looking at software. So we're going to talk about that for just a minute. The use of open source software has raised a lot of questions. And while those who are building and writing the open source software and throwing it out in the wild are doing amazing things, but at the same time, we're seeing companies, critical infrastructure, taking that open source, adding things on top, and then selling that product. So I think we have a challenge in both the rush to market on the company side as they're doing this, but for those who are users of open source software, when we think about vulnerabilities and vulnerability disclosure or risk, I'm going to just go down the panel. Each of you talk a little bit about how you feel about that and where you think maybe not just the US, but where other governments and countries should be going. Grant?
Yeah, so we're a big user of open source, and I think it's a great thing for the community. It does come with trade-offs, right? So, you know, is it good? Is it bad? Has it been checked for vulnerabilities? Is it not? I always think that most all security problems can be fixed with very basic things. We didn't talk about basics a whole lot today, but you know, even the SBOM processes that we have of making sure you're looking at all code holistic, whether it's source, whether it's fuzzing, or source analysis, dynamic analysis to look at what is being produced. We're also big contributors to open source as well. We've done a lot with Nginx or Nginx, and I think that from a security standpoint, it's there's going to be risk in anything you do. Every company has vulnerabilities. That's just the matter of it, and so I think having good process to support, making sure you understand the vulnerabilities, making sure you have that. So we've done a lot of things in adding to kind of our product security group to focus on that, but I think that's got to be a focus for companies like ourselves that produce software for people to secure it. But we also have a supply chain as well, and that's an expectation as well.
And there's trust in that supply chain. So Meta?
Oh, yeah, well, we fully focus in the open source world, right? The Casper protocol and the underlying technology is 100% open source. And what's really great about public layer 1 blockchain protocols is those systems are completely under attack. The Casper protocol is worth over $500 million. And so there is tremendous incentive for black hat hackers to attack the network to try to steal funds from the network. And so if you are going to use blockchain technology, you can even run a private permissioned instance, but I highly recommend that you select a public layer 1 technology, right? Even if you instantiate your own private instance, because that technology has been battle tested, right? And the higher the valuation of the public protocol, the more it's been battle tested in the wild. And so our engineers take a security first approach. We do extensive fuzzing testing, auditing, code reviews, always putting security at the forefront, because that's the most important thing that the protocol has to uphold is security.
So I think that I completely agree with you. And someone on the earlier panel had said, if you see a bridge, how do you know what the bridge is made of? And I do want to go back to SBOM. So software bill of material. It's been around for a long time. We've always talked about software bill of material, but the White House executive order has really highlighted it. So, supply chain is very complex. We have blockchain, we have AI writing code, we have APIs, we have open source. And so how do you know that the hardware, the software, the inputs, the outputs is secure? And that's where SBOMs come into play. I think it's a way of being proactive instead of reactive when you know what's going into what makes that inventory from an SBOM perspective. I think that's probably the first layer when it comes to software security, is knowing what is there, but it's very complex. So you think about a missile, right? A missile has 10,000 components to it, everything from hardware to software to a motherboard. But do you know exactly what's there? That's what Lockheed and all of them are trying to do. So try to doing that at such a broad scale in software, especially with these emerging technologies, I think is going to be very tough. But like I said, the White House executive order has called it out. There's a NIST framework specifically related to SBOMs. There's also, open source SSF. So it's coming into play now.
Yeah. One thing that's interesting, I'm going to sort of tie a bow on this and we'll go into some other issues, is at least the opining in the United States, although with allied countries, what they have basically said is those who use and take open source software and embed it into their products and services that they sell, you now own 100% of that liability and vulnerability for what's in the code. And so I think this issue of vulnerability disclosures, or SBOM, is a very different shift that people don't quite understand, right? A lot of times it's sort of, no, not my problem, somebody else wrote it, I'm just using it. So one of the things as we think about just the issue of sourcing though, I was thinking of the last time we were here in 2020, right before COVID, we all went home, it shut down, and what COVID showed us was the fragility of our supply chains, and whether it was where your people were, or your sourcing, or your products and services, it really was a systemic change, I think, for everyone. Fast forward to geopolitical risk right now with Ukraine and the Middle East. For each of you, as you think about, you can answer the question either for your own company, or how you look at your supply chain. How has some of these challenges changed maybe the way that you do business, either with others or for yourself?
Yeah, I'll take that. I think the first thing, and even going through this, we had an incident that we wrote a blog about it. Interesting blog, you can check it out. But we had an incident with an identity provider, and it does when you go through something when your supply chain, especially a SaaS-based identity provider, gets hit, it makes you think about what is important to me in the business. And so, right, when we look at it, we say, we want to eliminate any dependency of a third party of anything that's core to us. And I think that's a very interesting way to do it. If it's ancillary, we'll look at it and look at third parties. But if it's core to the business, we're not going to outsource it now, excluding some hardware things that we do. But even that, with a lot of the hardware, we have our own BIOS, it's written, we burn it in, we validate it. But I think when you look at this, and the one thing that there's probably two things I think of, maybe one thing I think about in supply chain is like integrity, right? Integrity of the people, not necessarily the integrity of the technology. And so I always think about this and go are people being honest with you with the security assessments that you're doing? No, Avni checks me, and she audits us quite a bit. But I think that that's something to pay very good close attention of. Do you have a partner that is willing to engage on the conversations? And I've seen very, everybody has their challenges, but if you look at supplier assessments, they're always good. And then they ask for more money to do more things, to fix controls that aren't maybe in place that they tell you that are in place. And so when you look at supply chain, I always think it's just such a trust component of what you're doing. And we often miss that piece of it. And so, does that organization have integrity? Do you know the people at that? So if you're going to outsource something, there is the security assessment process, but it's also good to know the CISO. It's also good to know how the engineering teams work and have a relationship, especially if it's dependent on your organization, if that technology is dependent on your organization.
Yeah. Meta?
I mean, definitely from a tooling perspective, the blockchain does a great job in establishing multi-party trust, right? So you can validate and authenticate what was done, when it was done, who it was done by, and using a digital signature to get guarantees around an event taking place at a specific time thanks to the blockchain, right? So I like to look at this as blockchain is a trust layer. It's the ideal use case for blockchain is to establish multi-party trust. So what we have found in the adoption of blockchain, specifically in supply chain, is the governance problem, right? Where you have multiple parties coming together, you need to agree that you're going to use a decentralized ledger or even a partially centralized ledger with multiple parties. That's where you can open up the conversation with your suppliers to say, look, for the benefit of all, right, let's use this technology, let's all agree to use this tool to get transparency and trust in the supply chain.
So, Grant, I have seen exactly what you've seen is, large enterprise organizations are bringing everything back internally, even their manufacturing plants. We're seeing a massive increase of real estate for manufacturing. But what's happening in the small to medium business, though, they're not able to do that, right? They don't have the financial resources to be able to do that. So they're still saying, I am good at X, Y, and Z, and everything else is going to be outsourced. I think your vendor management process has to be really strong. I agree, security assessments, but remember, security assessments are a period, and they're point in time, and they're looking back, right? So, which I still think everyone should do, but I think what's really important is continuous monitoring kind of going forward. And I think that's when you have to have a really strong security program with a lot of budget and a lot of buy-in from the board. And that's what I worry about, right, is, people think it's check the box. People think, okay, well, when we're doing our vendor management program, let's ask for the SOC report. Let's have them complete a security questionnaire. You have to go deeper than that because you're going to be the one. I mean, look what happened. We look at supply chain attacks, Log4j, Kaseya. We've seen SolarWinds. I mean, who's on the front page? It's not their supplier who's in the third party. So going kind of back to the basics and saying, what are they doing? Does it match what our security protocols are going to be? Yes, ask for their security questionnaires and so forth, but you have to have something that's continuous that you can rely on.
I mean, that's spot on, right? Security assessments are one point and one time. I was working with a company trying to map their global supply chain, and they said, do we really have to do this? And I'm like, yes. And then, 2 months later, are you sure this is hard? And you're like, well, of course it's hard, but you are now selling across critical infrastructure. You're a government contractor, right? You have to change, I think, the way you think about it. And when we think about the attackers, right, they have the basics. They want to steal, disrupt, or destroy. And so they can go after the big companies, which they do, or they can go after the weakest link, which is still the supply chain. I think the challenge we have for the larger companies is you have very complicated first, second, third party in your supply chain, you have trusted vendors, you have the mom and pop companies who have performed amazing for the last 20 years, but they may not be ready for where we are. So maybe a quick question on that trust as the theme, certainly for the West, rebuilding trust. How do you look at how you help maybe your vendors and your supply chain, because you all will ultimately, or could, be held responsible? Do you want me to go backwards? You okay? No, you can go.
So I can tell you from a client perspective. So when we talk about first and second, I think that we need to go a lot more. I mean, suppliers are using suppliers who are using suppliers, right? And so I think the first thing I tell our clients is you need to have an inventory of your suppliers and who they are using. And sometimes that's not going to be possible to do. So understanding what the ecosystem is and feeling comfortable of what the ecosystem is, or you do pull it in, or you go somewhere else, or you go to another vendor. I think that, again, has to be baseline. We did it with technology, and we did it with data, right? When it was ours, we were able to inventory it. Who's the owner? How is it used? Where is it housed? We need to go back to that, even when we're using third parties.
Yeah, I completely agree. I feel like, you can't ignore your suppliers and their suppliers. And even if you're using a tool like blockchain, trust is ultimately established offline, right? And so the social constructs of trust still have to be there, even if you can look back at history and say, okay, this is where the problem was. We recorded on an immutable chain. You're still establishing trust off-chain, right, outside of the tooling. Irrespective of what the tooling is, you're still establishing trust outside of that.
Yeah, I may answer a little different. I always think the best metric is how many suppliers have you rejected? Yeah. And so it's an interesting thing because well, how many have we rejected? Well, we don't do that. We help them. I'm like, well, are we assuming that a risk? And have we looked at the supply chain well enough? And so are we just saying, hey, we're going to build a mitigation plan for whatever the vendor is? And so I think what you see is you got to dig deeper to the 6, 7 layers deep. And I remember in 2005, I was talking to a big telco, and we were talking about 6th and 7th party risk, right? You outsource, to a vendor who outsources to a vendor who outsources to a country that outsources, like, and you don't even know what there is. And I think, and sometimes, that they may not even know what their supply chain is. That's why I always think the trust of an organization and how well they're run is very important. Because in some ways, we're kind of gambling every time we do a third party that do they have better security than me? And like my argument always is like, I don't think so. Especially when I came from the big bank, when I had $1 billion budget and 1,500 people that worked for me. I'm pretty sure I had better security than everybody in this room that wasn't a bank that had that. But we were afforded to be able to do those things. And so the bigger you get, the more scrutiny you put on. I think to the mom and pop, if you're a $50 million company, it's harder to do that. Even if you're a $50 million startup, security, you're doing very well, are you putting the same amount of resource in it? And so I always look at some of the kind of qualitative viewpoints of who the company is, and like, is that somebody we're going to invest in? Do I want to put my crown jewels into that organization? Do I trust them enough? And trust is such a big word. I always think blockchain's about trust, right? So, and trust in just a different way. We've seen the breaches with blockchain, haven't been the actual blockchain technology, they've been around fundamentals around access control. So, right, and so, do they have the people that can put those access controls? And so I always just struggle with this a little bit because I'm like, well, do you have access controls? And yes, we have access controls. What kind of access? We have role-based access controls. Like, we have attribute role-based access. We have MFA on everything. I'm like, that doesn't exist. Like, now we're talking about the tooth fairy. And so...
and unicorns.
And unicorns and puppies. And so I like puppies. But, I think that's, that's something that I think you have to factor in because we always go, you always ask these questions. I'm like, nobody has MFA across 100% of their applications.
But there's not full authentication and verification of these issues, right? Most times it's a paper exercise. Go ahead.
But, we also have to, how do you balance it? Like, I've heard so many people say, like, I can't get to market because of the supplier security policy. Like, there's just so much vendor management going on. Like, how am I supposed to build something? How am I supposed to go to market? How am I supposed to, you're stifling innovation because of over review, right? And it is a balance, but like, how do you meet that? I'm curious. Like, that's a question, I guess, for you guys is, is there, like, look, do you want someone to have your crown jewels and you want them to have the best security, but without them, are you not going to be able to go to market as quickly? Like, what is the balance? And it's a hard answer for me to give people.
Yeah, we just had a situation where, that just turned off.
That might be a sign.
Oh, we're done. Maybe we'll hit the button. We had a situation where, LLMs and generative AI, like, hey, we want to put this onto, so we had a situation where, hey, we had an organization inside of Cloudflare that wanted to, hey, we want to record all interviews with generative AI, use LLMs, or record them back, and I'm like, that sounds terrible, right? And so we had a conversation with the HR group, like, do you really think that is a wise decision with a company, and then what is going to be disclosed in these conversations? So going back to the business and saying, is this something that we want to make an investment in? And they pulled it, right? They said, we don't think that's at the time we want to do this. It sounds great to be able to, because we have a crazy interview process,
right?
That like, we have thumbs up and you have to write paragraphs, and yeah, it would be great to do it, but.
What you're pointing out, I think, is still the systemic problem we have in companies in general. And we keep saying enterprise risk management, which is 100% true, but no one understands what that means. So the HR team, they do HR. Like, these common sense questions we would want different aspects of the business to ask and think about, they're still not doing that. And when you try and do the inventory of software, there's not a single point in the company who understands, because each business unit has its own contracts and vendors, and so we're still chasing our tails and trying to, I think, educate people on what security means and how to manage it. Now, one of the things that happens when companies rush to market, right, first to market, that's all they care about, there are problems and they implode. And then what happens is the US government, the European Union, or each of these countries are negotiating multilateral agreements to come to the same regulatory approach. And so what we find on the regulatory side is very few decision makers understand what the technology is. So we either have over-regulation or re-regulation, or we have these fights amongst agencies about who's on first. And if you're in critical infrastructure, In your banking financial services, it's a hot mess. But if you're energy, electric utilities, you got to write your own regulations. So how do we help, let's focus on the positive, how do we help decision makers and regulators around the world understand the technology, risk, because the supply chain piece is being mandated across the world?
Yeah, so there, I'll take it from two angles in industries. So I spend time in critical infrastructure, right? Nuclear, they actually let things burn in for 6 months before they actually put it on the floor. Could a bank do that? No. Could I do that? Absolutely not, right? But there's a tolerance that they do. And so I always think we talk about AI and nuclear, well, you can't do that because there's data diodes on everything and you can't move data. It's super difficult to do. And so, I think from a risk tolerance, the NRC's done a good job of saying what you can and what you can't do. Now, I think when you get, and that business is probably actually relative, it's gonna sound crazy, it's relatively simple, nuclear. You just put a rod in some water and boils and spins and creates magic. But I think when you get to banking, what you do see is massive enterprise risk management that actually take, if you've tried to run a contract through a bank, it takes 6, 9, 12 months because of the rigor put into it, but it's actually probably a facade of what it is, of sign off, but the regulators want you to make sure that you have, everybody's looked at it, everybody understands the risk and that you've gone through it adequately, and it's usually a good process, but it's cumbersome, and so you have, I've had to revamp both. As part of the revamp, especially with the Fed, the OCC, PRA, HKMA, all on how do you revamp the vendor management process? And over the last 3 or 4 years, MRAs, MRIAs, consent orders have been put down on banks to do it, but it's still a very difficult thing to do.
Well, we're not going to get into the challenges of the SEC on top of all of the independent regulators and what we're seeing from New York DFS and global regulators or Singapore. I can go on. Now, Meta. We've talked about this. In the world of blockchain and layer ones, what we do have a little bit of a challenge with in that understanding of technology is so many, whether it's in the United States or around the world, believe that blockchain is crypto. They're exactly the same things, and they're very different. So as you navigate through that, again, this is about how do we help them better understand and not over-regulate in some of these areas. And yours is a little more unique.
Yeah, definitely. Look, there's a lot of education still happening in the blockchain space and the role that cryptocurrency plays in blockchain and, versus the underlying technology. And like I said, the role that crypto plays, crypto is a use case for blockchain technology, how you can have something of value being secured by a peer-to-peer network. And so, like I said, when you're selecting a blockchain layer, why would you want to use a layer 1 public blockchain as the basis of your technology? Well, you want to use it because it's going to be the most secure. There's a really, really big carrot out there for all those hackers to go after, and they have a strong incentive to try to attack the network. And so when you deploy that infrastructure, even if you deploy a private fork of it in your own infrastructure, it's been battle tested, right? Blockchain is not crypto, but that crypto use case provides a really great mechanism by which that software, that underlying node software, gets battle tested. And I sincerely hope, through perseverance and time, that the regulators will come to understand the difference. It's important that they understand the difference because the underlying technology has a tremendous, tremendous opportunity for organizations, governments, and corporations alike to reclaim a significant amount of their compliance costs and overhead, right? There's a lot of effort that is spent, probably 5% of GDP overall, just in double checking data, checking the provenance of data. And when you think about supply chain, even within pharma, and you think about if I want to bring a drug to market, that clinical trial data is checked 3 times manually. Right now, just imagine the amount of savings just in that simple use case. If you could have guarantees around the data and you wouldn't have to go through that kind of rigor, how much more quickly you could bring really effective and high quality drugs to market. So tremendous opportunity in the underlying technology, and it's really important that regulators get educated that there is a big, big difference between crypto and blockchain and the role that crypto plays.
I know I've been doing that for about 3.5, 4 years, so maybe together we can all get there. All right, Avni?
Yeah, I think there needs to be marry of public and private and industry partnership. I mean, you take a look at the regulators. If any of you have gone through FedRAMP or CMMC, the first draft that came out, there was no way that any company was going to be able to get their authority to operate to do work for the federal government. It just wasn't going to happen. It was done in a silo, and it just would have cost multi-millions of dollars to be compliant in there. But when you have, we're starting to see more. ISO 42001 came out, which is for AI, responsibility and trustworthiness. We did see several CISOs come out helping. The SEC cybersecurity, we saw the comment was actually about 40% of CISOs did comment and they did make changes. I think that's what we're going to have to see a little bit more. Over-regulation does stifle innovation, 100%. You need to get to a baseline of what the framework is or a baseline of the regulation and then give the organization a bit of customization and flexibility to say, this is what works for us with that. And that's what we've seen with ISO. That's what we're starting to see a bit with some other regulations that are out there. But I think it's going to be that public-private industry partnership all coming together to work.
That's right. I'll say this, having been a regulator in the U.S. government and coming out, I know I'll be kicked out of the private sector club if I say the best regulation is X, right? Because, people have an opinion. But the best regulation is one that is outcome focused, right? At the end of the day, regulators need to care about the outcomes, safety, security, right? Whatever, if you're delivering that product or service. What we really need to do with global regulators is have them understand the technology enough to understand the outputs. And I do think that the kind of tech sector and everyone who is here needs to, unfortunately, become more patient as you're educating the decision makers. And, one person I worked with many years ago said, well, they're stupid, and why do I have to spend time explaining it to them? I'm like, they're in charge, and they can either help you get your product to market or not, right? So these are tough times. Now, I think no one is giving us the hook, so I'm going to do one more question, and this is actually on AI. Right? When we talk about supply chain, there are many tools to manage supply chain. Machine learning's been one. AI apparently is the cure to everything in the universe. Not. We do have a new AI executive order in the United States, and we've talked about all these components. But if we're back to that validating and authenticating a supply chain, right, you have to be able to deconstruct that. So I'm giving everyone a hard question. What is the number one thing you think we should all work on as we think about the use of AI in supply chains, risks and opportunities? Avni looks like she wants to go first.
I think it has to be transparency of the algorithms. I think that's the only way you're going to build trust with the users.
Excellent. Okay.
So I'll say maybe this is a little different. I think the data is going to be a problem. And so we always talk about AI, but it's really about data, and it's really about features and changing data to manipulate it. But what we're seeing is all the data sovereignty rules. And so when you contract with a third-party supplier, supply chain, where does that data go? And so I think that's an interesting viewpoint. And so whether you're in Singapore, Australia, UK, France, Argentina, Canada, US, somewhere in Europe, they're all having different regulations, all different data components. So you actually not only have to know your suppliers, but where they operate. The other thing that I think is going to pop up in AI is 70% of all the GPUs are owned by US-based companies, by the big three cloud providers. And so I think that's a very, so when we're talking about GPUs and we're talking about data, most of it comes back to the US. And so I think that's going to hit a head at some point because there's such a, if you're China, they may not like that. If you're some of the non-US, that's great for the US people, but it may not be great for non-US people. And so we don't want always governments don't trust governments always, but I think when you get to this, we're going to get in a problem of jurisdiction of data and GPUs very soon around data and supply chain.
Or more and worse. Meta?
I'm actually seeing a vision. We've heard a lot about the governance of AI systems, here at the WEF and in this, session today. And what I see AI is being governed by decentralized blockchains, ultimately. Decentralized blockchains will bring the trust layer, the transparency, and ultimately, even for data owners, for data provenance, and data copyrights. If you think about if I'm a data owner and I want to be reimbursed or compensated for the data that I'm providing to the AI, being able to prove that I can train that AI model, that that training is valuable, that it's been validated by the community, and then being rewarded for that. So big vision, but I see that ultimately decentralized blockchains will govern these AI systems, particularly if they're going to be used globally by a community, right? And what you'll see is this decentralized community governing this AI and making sure that it's not hallucinating or have bias in the long run. That's a big vision, though.
Absolutely. Well, I know we're out of time. One of the topics we didn't get to in supply chain, of course, is the physical security component, right? Thank you so much. I was telling the team right after 9/11, I worked on a project that was physical security at the point of origin of manufacturing all the way through your supply chain. And then about 5 or 10 years later, we added cyber. And so maybe next year, Val's not paying attention. We're going to do physical and cybersecurity in the supply chain and the convergence, 100%. Well, I know I really appreciate everyone for being here today. Thank you so much. Let's give the panel a round of applause.
Thank you.